Hi, I'm Mark Rutten. Welcome to Nomad Boatbuilding. I'm starting a new project. It's a 14-foot long blued lapstrake sailing dinghy. Now, if you've watched any of my other boat building series, you know that they're long and they tend to go into great detail on every aspect of the build. I thought we would do this one a little bit different. In this new series called Building Gannet, we're just going to focus in on some core fundamental techniques or concepts that I think have a broad applicability to any boat building project. So today we're going to get started with plans. The beginning of any project involves acquiring a set of plans. And for those who are new to boat building, those can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand. So I thought today we would just try and demystify those for you.
Okay, I thought we'd take a look at my next project. We're going to start today with just looking at plans and looking at some of the ways I'm going to get started on a project. So this project is the Ian Outred Gannet, which is a glued lapstrake sailing dinghy. And it's in this sort of modern style of sailing dinghy. So it's intended to be a reasonably higher performance dinghy without getting into advanced bells and whistles. So a relatively plumb transom, a relatively beamy hull, a relatively round bilge, and this boat's going to have a sliding gunter rig. We are not going to be straying too far from the plans on this project. These plans are just a little bit outside of the ordinary. I'll just point out a few of the things that are atypical for them. So in any typical set of plans, we have a number of drawings. The one that should be the most familiar to a layman's eyes would be the construction drawing, which is this particular page. And that shows you the details of the boat in terms of how it's put together. Interior components, the exterior components, the deck. There's usually some cross sections that show you what those components might look like. And a lot of details referring to the sizes of parts and the types of materials, types of timber you might be using. Now, Ian Outred sometimes offers variations on a particular design, and this is one of the things that he's done here is he's presented us with an open version of this boat, and then there's a decked over version. Part of that drawing is shown here, and part of that drawing is shown here, and part of that drawing is shown over here and up there. So it's broken up into little pieces. The boat doesn't really change. The hull remains exactly the same, but it's just some minor construction details that differ. So we don't need a whole separate drawing for that. What you can't find in those details, you would just refer to the main drawing to give you a general idea as to what those things might look like. Now, Ian's drawings are unique in that he tends to present both metric and imperial dimensions. Most of the time, you either have one or the other. So that's something to take note of. His metric dimensions are almost always just in millimeters. And then his imperial ones, of course, are in inches, fractions of an inch, and feet if necessary. I think in most cases, you're going to find that it's showing just inches and not feet so much. So this is a typical scale, which is 1.5 inches to the foot, which is 1/8 scale. So that's fairly convenient because when you're using a regular imperial ruler, every 1/8 of an inch represents an inch in full size, and so it's relatively easy to scale off of the drawing. Unlike engineering drawings, in boat drawings, we tend to scale right off of the drawing if there's some missing information. In an engineering drawing, you would never do that. You're always looking for someplace where the dimensions are specified. Now, something that's often typical of this type of construction drawing is where they show you the building setup. So in this case, the side view is represented right here. It's a cross section through the boat showing the interior components, the assemblage of the backbone, but it's also represented on the building base. So if you turn the drawing upside down, all the dimensions related to the building base, or the strong back as we call it, are written down in here. So the idea being that you're going to make your molds, you're going to set them up on this strong back. Now, one thing I will say about this particular drawing is that there are some minor details that I'm having a very difficult time interpreting on this drawing. So I'm working on the centerboard trunk at the moment, and I'm trying to pick out dimensions off of that trunk. There's no detailed drawing of the trunk on its own, and some of the details like where the pivot point is hard to interpret on this drawing. These feel a little bit rushed in some ways. I know it should be on there, so I'm looking for it, and I figured it out, but it took a little while for me to sort of really zero in on exactly which of these dimensions were referring to it. And another odd thing is that there's no information about how the centerboard is being used in this boat. That is, there's no notes indicating what kind of tackle you would need to hoist it up or put it back down. It's being left to the builder to figure that out. So next we have a sail plan, and this usually shows the hull itself, the sail rig in it. Often this has got all the information you need to give to a sailmaker to make the sails for this particular boat. It's going to have information about the spars you're going to need. And then here we've got details for the center board itself and the rudder. So on the sail plan, there'll also be some notes for there's the reefing points here, for instance. I've given you a diagonal across here for the hypotenuse of the sail, and then some other dimensions that indicate how much the roach of the sail has beyond that. And then this drawing is the lines plan. So this is the core information for developing the shape of the boat, both for the designer who's producing this on paper and for the builder who's going to create a full-size drawing of the boat. Now, Ian has provided full-size drawings for the molds, so I don't have to do the lofting. That said, I always kind of wish I had to do the lofting. It does take time though, so if you've got the molds already produced for you, or at least the drawings of the molds, there's no need to go through the process of going through a lofting, but there's information that is really nice to have at full scale, and there is an understanding of how certain details are going to go together that are better understood at full scale than at a smaller scale. So the lines plan is made up of several views of the boat: a profile view right here, a plan view, which is this one right here, which looks at the boat from the bow on one side and from the stern on the other, and what we call the half breadth view, which is this one here, which is a bird's eye view of the boat. And then there's some other lines down here that look like they're part of a bird's eye view of the boat, but they're not. They're actually called diagonals. And these lines represent what these sections through the center of the boat is. These diagonal sections through the boat are described in this view. And those are used primarily to help ferre out these lines, to make sure that all of these shapes coincide with each other. In fact, all of the lines you see in a lines drawing do exactly that, but the diagonals are used as sort of a final check. And they also are useful because they cut through the boat most obliquely to the various sections of the boat, and so you will hopefully get the best representation of those forms flowing together in the form of these diagonals. These lines in the half-breadth view are actually water lines. So the water lines are represented in the profile as these horizontal lines running through the boat. Think of them like slices through a cake, a layer cake. And so if you take each of those slices and then turn them up on end, this is what they look like when you look at them from a bird's eye view. The plans drawing, or the elevations, which show the front and the back from the ends of the boat, those are represented by these other lines here, which are like slices of bread. And we refer to those as sections. So there are lines drawn across the whole drawing here. Each one of these lines is one of these sections. And lastly, we have what are called the buttock lines. So the buttock lines are represented in the half-breadth view as these horizontal lines running through here, and these are vertical slices through the hull. And in the profile drawing, they are represented by these curved lines here. Now the buttock lines, again, are useful for ferrying the hull out. They're not very useful near the bow because the way the lines interact with these sections, they come together at sort of oddball acute angles, and so it's really hard to represent these accurately. But in the stern of the boat, where these buttock lines are coming straight through the bottom of the boat back here, they become very useful. And the straighter the buttock lines are, the faster the boat theoretically is. So a double ender would have basically swooping buttock lines fore and aft. They're not very fast compared to a boat with a transom, and just as you see in modern racing boats, transoms tend to be wide. The back of the boat tends to be very shallow, flat sections, and so they create these very flat buttock lines, which give the boat a lot of buoyancy and lift. Now the water lines do the best job of describing the front end of the boat. And so that's why we see these in through here. They're fine for the back end, but they don't really relate to performance very much because the most useful ones are the buttock lines down low, which are below the water line. The other ones are above. They fare the hull out well enough, but they don't tell you very much. But at the bow, where waves are hitting the boat, the water lines tell you a little bit more about what the shape of the boat is as they enter the water. There are some designers who you'll see who draw the buttock lines in and the stern only. They only go halfway, and then they do the same thing with the water lines. They might draw them in at the bow. They may not continue them through the stern, but it depends on the designer. It varies. We have what's called a table of offsets here, and a table of offsets are a numerical dimension that indicates where each of the intersections of all of these lines are. They're listed over here. Heights from the designed water line, which is right through here, what they call the designed water line, where the boat sits in the water. These are dimensions showing the heights above that. And then these ones are showing the half breadths, so it's showing all these dimensions. And then lastly, the diagonals are showing these dimensions. There's usually a system of using a 3-digit coordinate that lists feet, inches, and eighths of an inch. Ian's a little different here. He has listed inches and 16ths of an inch, which is a bit odd. And sometimes he'll represent these in both metric and imperial. In this case, he's just gone with imperial. We should have that listed here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Offsets are in inches and 16ths to the inside of the planking and forward face of the transom. And it tells you how far apart the sections are spaced, how far apart the water lines are spaced, and how far apart the buttocks are spaced. And now this is where Ian has done us the service of not forcing us to loft the boat. He's given us a cross-section of the stem, which is an important detail we need when we're building the boat. He's given us a bit more information that has to do with how we're going to set up the transom at the appropriate rake and the appropriate height above the strong back. You'll see there's a cross section through the stem. Now, I like it when there's more of these. If you look at a drawing by Paul Gartside, for instance, he'll often have several sections through the stem, which is what you really want. Having just one, I'm not super happy about that, but we'll make do. And having sections through this is important because this helps to tell us how the planking interacts with the stem, and therefore it's going to help tell us how we're going to bevel off the stem in order to accept the planking. Without having those details, a lot of this is going to be by hook and by crook. Basically, I can pull off how much bevel is on this particular area of the stem right here, but it's going to change throughout the length of the stem, and so it means I'm going to have to figure it out on the boat. It's not the end of the world, but it's nice if I can pre-bevel as much as possible before we've set it up on the mold. And then lastly, we've got the sections of the boat drawn full size. So this is what I need to make my molds. So it's showing the forward sections of the boat over here, the aft sections of the boat over here. It's giving me a full-size drawing of my transom, and it's giving me some sections through my stem, if you're looking dead onto the stem, which is important because this particular stem flares out quite a bit. Down here, it's perhaps 2 inches wide where it hits the keel, but up near the stem head, it flares out to 4 inches or even closer to 6 inches for the inner part of the stem, which Ian refers to as the apron. It's a lot to look at here, and it can be hard to determine exactly what information is important to you, and it might take you a little while to figure that out. And so what I find the simplest way to move forward is to actually make mylar patterns of these molds in order to produce the molds. So in this case, I've actually laid this out on a piece of plywood, put some mylar over top of it, and then I've driven nails through the drawing and the mylar at various points along the way, usually the laps, and then I've sprung a flexible batten or a bundle batten through these lines. The bundle batten is just a bunch of thin strips of wood fastened together at one end, and you want a fair girth of them, and that's going to give you a nice fair curve. It allows it to bend it throughout a tight bend, but still give you a fair curve. Much more fair than if you just tried to take one thin piece of wood. And that's important because we want fair curves in everything we draw. So I find making the Mylar is an important step because it forces me to really understand the drawing in detail. It forces me to look closely at it, find a particular part and find all of its elements and resolve those in my head in order for me to produce the Mylar. I'm not just blindly trying to trace the paper pattern onto Mylar. I'm going through it one step at a time, one part at a time, and making sure I understand each part, how it's going to go together, and then moving on to the next one. And in doing that, it allows me to get at least an element of what I normally glean from doing a lofting. It still forces me to think a little bit harder because I'm not seeing this laid out full size. I'm not seeing the whole profile of a boat laid out full size to help justify these details too, but it really helps a lot. And so that's just the method I like to use. And now that I've got the Mylar, it's easy for me to lay it onto my mold making material to retrace those lines out and produce the molds. So my first step in building any of these boats is generally to try and get onto the pattern making process as soon as I can. You know, you go through the drawings and try and understand as much as you can. So Ian has provided a list of hull materials. As I'm going through the drawings and figuring out what I'm about to build, I'm finding that there's elements that are not represented on this shopping list. So, you know, it's making me think a little bit harder. So one of the things I like to do is to keep my drawings clipped to a piece of card here. So this is just some coroplast, but could be cardboard or light piece of plywood or whatever, it doesn't really matter. And it just helps to keep the drawings nice and flat, keeps them from getting beat up, and allows me to sort of set them to the side quickly and easily, or drag them over to where I'm working to refer to them easily. I can just stand it up and have a look at them.
Now I know understanding plans is probably old hat to a whole bunch of you out there, but I hope I brought a little bit of clarity to those of you who are just getting started in small wooden boat building. Now please join me again in the next episode of Building Gannet when we take a look at how I'm going to get started on actually building this boat. If you've enjoyed these videos and you'd like to support the channel, please consider joining me on Patreon. You can find links in the corner down in the description. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.